What's up, everybody? It's Dane Miller from GarageStrength.com. I've coached athletes at the world-class level in 6 different sports, and I am excited to weigh in on Clarence Kennedy's take on anabolic steroids, and I'm going to start right now. So over the last week or two, Clarence Kennedy, Clarence O on YouTube, has started to talk about why anti-doping really should not actually happen. And Zeb from Weightlifting House came in and he also weighed in with his opinion. And basically what I think is important here is to simplify this debate, to simplify this discussion really. And both guys do a very, very good job of keeping it civil and keeping it to a discussion, right? This is a long-term process on how we can optimize and handle doping in the sport, specifically the sport of Olympic weightlifting. And what I want to see here is that everybody can try to see the arguments through the filter of Clarence is essentially saying that for the sport of Olympic weightlifting and for all sports to be more fair, doping should be legal. Okay, doping should not have any problem or any punishment. And for the sport of specifically Olympic weightlifting, in the Weightlifting House's argument, doping should be illegal. And both guys do a good job of presenting their side. And I wanted to weigh in and just sort of analyze this and see it through that filter. That filter can provide a lot of simplicity. And so we're going to dive right into this immediately because there's a couple arguments that I really like on Clarence's side. There's a couple arguments I really like on Zeb's side. And I feel as though because I worked with athletes in the NFL, in Olympic weightlifting, in swimming, in track and field, in sprint cycling, in wrestling, in freestyle wrestling, and I have athletes that have competed at the world championship level on all of these sports, and multiple of these athletes have had world championship medals, and on top of that, some of them have actually competed against people who have tested positive and even beaten them. So I think it's an interesting perspective, and I think one of those perspectives is also keeping in mind we're not really hearing the athlete's side yet on this topic, so we haven't really listened to that athlete side. So I'm excited to get into this and dive deep into this entire topic.
But before I get into the video, I'd just like to address the most common criticism on my video. A lot of people were mentioning how I described America as a mostly drug-free country. It was kind of my fault because I didn't say that I was only talking about Olympic lifting. This kind of reminded me of Zach's video, so check out his video because I mostly agree with him. So I won't waste any more time. I'll just get straight into Seb's video.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the 4 main points that Clarence puts forward that fit essentially under this umbrella that anti-doping is unethical. And I'm going to talk about them and I'm going to show where we delineate logically. These 4 points are: 1, that it creates an unlevel playing field. 2, it facilitates corruption. 3, it demonizes PEDs. And 4, it forces athletes to use dangerous compounds. 1, it creates an unlevel playing field.
Okay, so one of the first things that Clarence brings up is to back up one of his statements is he brings up Balco, and Balco was a Bay Area lab back, and they essentially were more responsible for Barry Bonds utilizing performance-enhancing drugs, for Marion Jones and CJ Hunter, who was a shot putter and married to Marion Jones at the time. One of the things I see immediately in Clarence's argument is he talks about the state being in charge of this. Now, Balco, to me, Balco was actually a private entity. As far as I know, they did not have any state funding. Now, I do believe later on, Clarence starts to bring in how PEDs are demonized. And I think that it's important that I believe that the Balco scandal is actually like the scandal that truly demonizes PED use. I believe one of the things that I see right away with Clarence's argument, and again, seeing it through that filter of fairness, people who are against doping see the drugs as being bad. And I think that Americans see drug usage as bad for various reasons. One, they associate drug usage with the Soviet Union and with Eastern Germany. So that's a big cultural, sort of like that cultural war, right? 2, they see doping as a negative because they're looking at someone like Marion Jones, who was held on this pedestal. She was the hero of the United States. And then even Marion Jones was a cheater, right? And I actually do not believe at that point that it was the drugs that had the negative perception. Now, if we're talking about Eastern Germany and we're talking about the Soviet Union, I do believe it was the drugs to a point, because you can see different, female shot putters from East Germany that were transitioned to become men because they were on so many anabolics. That's a whole nother story, but I believe now, since Balco, most of the negativity associated with performance-enhancing drug usage is not based around the drugs, but more so around the cheating, and then more so around like, man, Marion Jones fooled us. She got us. She was the heart of America. Everybody, wanted to see her win all 4 of those medals in 2000, and then all of a sudden, everything was taken away because she was a cheater. She cheated against people who were clean. And I think that that's really important to differentiate, and that's an argument he does get into later on in his video.
The countries that invest the most into it are going to benefit the most. East Germany and Russia invested a lot into their doping program, and other countries are most likely investing in their doping programs right now to create new and more powerful PEDs. Drugs being banned from sports doesn't stop this. There would also be a massive incentive for a country to synthesize a designer steroid or a new PED, because it would be completely unknown by WADA, so they won't even be able to test for it. This would give...
Okay, so another part of Clarence's argument is based around the creation of designer steroid, and that's essentially what Balco did with, I think it was THG. There's definitely 100% credence to his argument here, that a lot of these countries that are invested in, he uses a Chinese weightlifter, and they very likely are on some designer steroids currently. That's speculation, but going into that, what's interesting is that I think that goes back to the system, okay? I think it goes back to understanding that that will happen, but that doesn't mean all countries are going to do that, and there also doesn't mean that there's no way to prevent that from happening. I actually believe that we could start to treat doping the way we treat, nuclear missiles, right? So it's like, you've got to have inspectors from the UN come into your nation, come into your country, and they get to go through labs, they get to look for stuff, they get to investigate whether or not there's actually serious missiles being created in various countries, and they're not allowed to do that based off of, treaties within the UN. I know that's a little bit of an outrageous analogy, but I actually look at it that way with WADA. I think if this is an issue, it's more so going to be an issue within WADA and less so an issue from the entire sport, because I do believe that a lot of that stuff has sort of gone by the wayside. Now, I think there's a couple other scenarios that I think he's 100% accurate on.
Balco was completely unregulated. There were no clinical trials and absolutely no safety testing. So in the drug development process, there's a lot of regulations in place to improve safety. Like, you probably heard a lot about that in the news recently. So if PEDs were legal, they would also be subject to the same regulations. I think a better question to ask is, the countries that invest the most money into doping will have an advantage. What would be a more fair situation? A world with anti-doping or a world without anti-doping? So we'll define fair as meaning a more level playing field. And keep in mind, this question is not asking about what causes more overall harm. I'll address that later. I think it's best to answer a single question at a time. I believe I answered that question in my video, but I'll briefly go over it again. Athletes will be free to use PEDs, unlike right now, where only some athletes can get away with it. Of course, there's a lot more nuance. People will make a counter-argument saying athletes, countries that invest the most money into doping will take the best PEDs, while poor athletes, countries, won't be able to take the best PEDs. I can't fully agree with this argument because it assumes the best PEDs will be highly inaccessible and expensive without explaining why, and it fails to answer why the no anti-doping option.
Seb from Weightlifting House sort of says, okay, if there's doping, it's going to be harder for poorer countries to have access to drugs, and drugs that are powerful. And, what ends up happening is Clarence comes back and he's like, well, actually, a lot of the really expensive drugs, he uses HGH as an example, aren't that effective for performance enhancement. And this is absolutely accurate. And I think that this is a very important aspect to understand, especially specific to Olympic weightlifting. If we're talking about this specific to weightlifting, right? Clarence is 100% accurate. A lot of poor countries, they still have testing on pharmaceuticals. So to get access to something like testosterone is actually pretty easy in these poor countries. They don't regulate their pharmacies as strictly as we do in the United States, but the drugs are still regulated. Now, with that being said, the most potent anabolics are gonna be testosterone, easily the best anabolic. It's almost always going to be referring to men. If you refer back to my videos I've done in the past for the best drugs to utilize for Olympic weightlifting, I actually go into all the positive tests and the drugs specifically that Olympic weightlifters like to utilize. Now, testosterone is very, very, very cheap. Okay, it's extremely inexpensive. It's extremely easy to get, and it's also pretty safe. It's very safe. On top of that, nandrolone, that's going to be another drug that a lot of weightlifters are going to utilize for joint integrity. It's pretty damn cheap, and it's pretty freaking safe. A lot of doctors in the United States will use testosterone and they'll use nandrolone as anti-aging agents. In this regard, I am absolutely going to stand behind Clarence, because the drugs that you'll end up utilizing now, something like oxandrolone, is going to be a little bit more expensive and a little bit more dangerous. Anything that's typically going to be oral is going to be a little bit more dangerous. And I think that's the part here that a lot of people have to understand, is there's so many different facets behind the discussion, and understanding drugs is part of it. Part of being a coach is understanding drugs and what drugs are really effective for certain sports, because you have to educate your people like, dude, don't take this stuff because you're going to get popped. So that's a very important factor that Clarence brings up, and he's absolutely accurate here.
Knowing then that that is what's going to be required to reach the elite levels in the sport, which teenager is going to join weightlifting? Whose parents are going to drive their kids to the gym, knowing that essentially the conclusion to them being a talented athlete is that they're going to have to take an enormous amount of gear. Essentially
Okay, one thing I wanted to bring up now, when they start to get into discussing children and teenagers and being extremely successful at that next level, they're bringing up parents. And one of the things we got to talk about, there's two factors here. In some countries, parents don't have much of a say. The kids will get put into these camps, they'll test them, and I know someone who used to be in the Bulgarian system for Greco-Roman wrestling, and they basically would go through all these tests in fitness class and gym class, and then they would get chosen based off of their limb lengths. Okay, you're going to go into wrestling. Okay, you're going to go into weightlifting. Okay, you're going to go into soccer or football. And it's the same thing in some of these Asian countries as well. You're going to get put into these, and the parents don't really have much choice. So that, I think, needs to be addressed regarding Zeb's argument around who's going to put their children into these sports knowing that later on they're going to get into anabolics. That's also under the guise that parents genuinely care about their children's long-term health. So we've got to address that. In the United States, one of the most, if not the most participated sport is American football. It's the NFL. And it is the most dangerous, most absolutely horrible sport for brain development, for concussions. There's deaths every year. It's a very, very violent sport that leads to tremendous amounts of issues from a scar tissue perspective in the brain. And so having that argument without acknowledging that's reality, a lot of parents don't care. They're so egotistical. They're more concerned about their child's success for themselves than they are for their child. That's reality. That's a lot of parents. And I'm in it. I see it on a regular basis at our gym. And I think that that's something that does have to be brought up. And on top of that, that doesn't mean we're putting kids on, if you're in a doping federation, that these kids will be on gas when they're 16, 17 years old. In some countries, that's the fact. That probably happened with Ilya. But I think it's important to recognize some parents just don't care. And it's crazy, but that's it.
Requirement to take drugs to compete would pressure athletes to take drugs when they don't want to.
Again, this is describing the current situation. For a kid to compete at the highest level in the current reality, they'll eventually have to use drugs. I also think this is worsened by the propaganda from WADA. A lot of talented kids believe they can become an Olympic champion they're fooled into believing that and only realize later on that the sport is pretty much full of drugs.
Also, as we know, humans, through their differences in physiology and endocrinology, respond differently to exogenous hormone.
People also metabolize and excrete hormones differently. You could argue in the current system that a person that lacks 2 copies of the UGT2B17 gene has good genetics because their genetics allows them to get away with taking more testosterone. It's really how you define good genetics. I would consider a person that responds better to PEDs as having great genetics.
Drugs in some ways make this romantic idea about sports fade even more. The moment that there is a PED free-for-all, the more the training...
I guess I would, going into this a little bit further is challenge Zeb to identify that romantic aspect of sports that he does talk about. What is that specifically? Because I think that does need to be addressed to a point, just so that we can see through the filter. All right, well, it's not fair for people who are clean to be competing against those who are doping because of X. And I think that I would assume what he's talking about is that never-ending story of the hero who's just constantly grinding and they're failing, but they're grinding and grinding and grinding, and then all of a sudden they can conquer their dreams, right? They become a champion and everything's hunky-dory because they've done all this. I'm not sure where that does fit into the argument. I think it does just need to go back to what is that fair playing field.
Clarence's second point is that it facilitates corruption. But there are other ways to be corrupt. Removing anti-doping wouldn't remove corruption from how people tend to act and respond in these kinds of situations. To my mind, this is just wishful thinking. There are plenty of other ways in weightlifting through which money can be transferred and pass hands under the table, just like paying an official to change someone's body weight when they go to compete.
I do believe there are other ways corruption can manifest.
This is where I think Zeb does a great job, because he shows it's not just about the drugs that is the problem here. There's corruption by paying off officials, there's corruption with altering birth dates, there's corruption with a lot of different factors. And I believe Zeb's argument there is phenomenal, because that's the root of everything, right? That's the root of all of these problems, is that the actual overwatching government or whatever you want to call it, leaders, Thomas Ayan over the last 3 or 4 decades, that's been the problem. And we've got to remember when we're talking about this discussion, especially with weightlifting, is that the corruption is deeply rooted because of Ayan, right? Like, that's where all this corruption stems from. So to just throw in the towel and say everybody should be on the gas, let's go, it's like, no, we've got to remember, dude, let's try and fix the system first. And that's where Zeb does a great job, because there's all these other ways that we also have to fight corruption to help improve the situation. And I think that that's a huge, and Clarence does, to his point, he does come back and acknowledge that. He's not saying that that's not happening. But I believe the weight on addressing that corruption is significantly greater than what we're recognizing, and that corruption is going to be coming down to the line. Who is going to watch the watchmen? And that's a real issue right now, and I think that there's some ways to go about doing that.
He also mentions weightlifters in the 80s lifting more than current weightlifters. That is true for sure, but I don't think it's fair to say that was definitely because of less drug testing. It may be the case that weightlifters trained much harder back then and the standard was way higher, and I would argue that was the case. Also, there are weightlifters right now who are never getting drug tested, so why aren't they beating lifters from the 80s?
Okay, so one of the things where I start to see with Clarence, where there starts to be holes in his argument, is he's making a blanket statement that guys back in the 80s were always training really, really well. They're always training really hard. They work really hard. And then kids today, they can't train hard. They don't train hard. They only work out 3 days a week and they never want to max out. First, I would beg to differ. Come to Garage Strength. We max out a lot more and we train more than 3 days a week. But also, he does get into the drug testing and how drug testing is not fair because North Korea, Iran, and Turkmenistan traditionally don't let people into their country to drug test. Now, to go back to his first argument there, that argument just doesn't sit well with me because I run a sports performance gym in the United States, and we've got our gym filled 6 days a week with high school kids, college kids, post-collegiate athletes that are just crushing themselves and hammering massive amounts of weight. And to me, that's like the old head, like my dad saying like, oh, millennials and Gen Zs, like they're just babies, they're entitled babies. Come on, like give a little bit of a better argument than that. So are there some people who are soft? For sure. But was training that much better? Was the effort that much better in the 80s? So you're saying the effort was much greater and the training methodology was down here. So the training methods are better now, but the effort's down here. And drugs didn't really matter that much. It's like, dude, really? Like, training methodology's here. People still train really hard now, but there's a lot less drug usage, a lot less. When I trained under Anatoly Bondarchuk, Dr. B would sit there and say, hey, we would take people and have literally just plates of pills. And during certain years, Yuri Sadiq, who's a world record holder, would eat a lot of drugs. This is from my coach, who was the head of the Soviet Union. He would take a lot of drugs, and you can look at the years he's throwing 86 meters, he was taking everything you could ever imagine. The years he wasn't, he was throwing 80 to 81 meters in the hammer. Guess what? People in the United States throw 80 meters today and 80 plus, almost 81, without drugs. So are you saying that those guys, that are throwing that today, well, they don't train that hard? Like, really? No. Like, dude, the drugs have a huge impact. And the fact that I had direct access to Dr. B and could hear Litvinov was on this, Yuri Tam was on this, Yuri Sadiq was on this, and Nikulin was on this. All of these guys, and then he knew Karelin. What was Karelin on? All of this stuff, like, that's such a half-ass argument that really just sort of poo-poos today's athletes like an old dude who just wants to sit there and complain that all kids today are entitled. So I don't buy that. But going back to this, he does bring up a very, very good argument regarding North Korea, Iran, and Turkmenistan. Now, that's a systematic problem. That is 100% a systematic problem, and I believe that problem can absolutely be addressed. But it has to be addressed more so from the IOC and from the leader of the IWF.
But I think what he meant to say was drug testing reduces the number of athletes using PEDs, and it can reduce the amount of PEDs a person can take, or it stops more kids from using PEDs. I would agree with that. There's no data. Again, I don't know the true answer to this question. No one does. There's a lot of data on the war on drugs and its problems, but there's pretty much none on this. A lot of people will say, you're just speculating, therefore you're wrong. But literally both sides of this debate requires speculation.
I do think this is also, so later on, Clarence, as he's discussing this, gets into, look, this anti-doping side, weightlifting house, doping side, Clarence, is speculation, okay? That's a main factor here, and that's all about how we're gonna move forward in the future. You have to understand speculation, but you also have to have a thought process that's able to filter through all of this information based off of people's actions in the past.
Higher than the number of PED users in sports. So it doesn't matter that much if anti-doping existing reduces overall harm or if it increases overall harm. Right now, the amount of harm done by PED use outside of sports is much higher. So that's what we should care about most. We should come up with solutions to fix that problem too. It's also how you define harm. A woman might be fully aware of the virilization side effects of anabolics, but may choose to take them anyway. Her goal to become a big bodybuilder will make her happy despite the side effects. So would this really be causing more overall harm to her? Does she have a mental problem? Does someone wanting to achieve the highest level in sports have a mental problem? Again, this is a long discussion.
3. It demonizes PEDs. Now, quick preface to this section. I don't believe that PEDs should be illegal for the general public. I don't think that PEDs should be demonized at all for non-competing citizens. And it's for that reason I have no problem with Clarence choosing to take them or Sally from down the road choosing to take them.
Now, as Seb just said, he does not believe that PEDs should be illegal for the general public. And part of the issue here is that Clarence has brought up that anti-doping essentially makes PEDs demonized. I still believe that it is no longer, that was the case in the past, but it is no longer the case. Now it is much more about the fact that the action of cheating is what demonizes these individuals. It is not the drugs, because now we can see, Lasha was on stanozolol, Toma was on stanozolol. Everybody loves her, right? And they love her for a good reason. She's emotional, she's got good technique, she's explosive, she's a really good weightlifter. Was she popped? Absolutely, same with Lasha, but they're good characters, right? They're good characters in the whole story. So if the PEDs are the issue, then everybody would still hate them. What's ironic is that sort of punches a hole into my argument, is that it's the act of cheating, but the act of cheating made people sort of dislike them for a little bit, and then they had to prove their way back into society or back into the weightlifting ranks, and now people sort of really appreciate who they are. And I think that that's one aspect that I think, to be clear, if you're on testosterone or nandrolone or whatever you want to take, these drugs should be legal if you know what they can do, and that you know what they can do to your lipids, they know what they can do to your health long term. Well, by all means, take them. It's not a big deal. I know a lot of people on drugs, and they're not horrible people. I know a lot of people who smoke weed. They're not bad people. And that's one factor now, is that society has matured tremendously. And he even brings up the Netherlands versus Sweden with the war on drugs, and it's a great argument. But I don't think that that's necessarily the argument he should be taking anymore, because even in the United States, where we have 44 states that have legalized marijuana in some way, shape, or form, people are starting to get over this factor now. It's not, if you're talking about something like heroin or crack cocaine, that might be more of a drug that does have a demonized viewpoint. But no one that I know is taking the stance of nandrolone is just as bad as heroin. So I don't really buy into that argument.
Recreational bodybuilding isn't drug tested, yet there are many that decide not to take drugs because they don't want to suffer side effects.
Now, this example of bodybuilding does a disservice to the argument that Clarence is putting forward to me. Making those sports a free-for-all in terms of the amount of drugs that can be used hasn't changed the public perception of them. And if anything, the public perception of bodybuilding and strongman is worse because of the rampant drug use. If people want non-drug tested weightlifting, which they clearly do based on Clarence's videos, which is fine by the way, then the good thing is that it is possible to start your own federation. But I don't think that the reduction in demonizing PEDs will be severe enough in the public opinion to grant the IOC this feeling that they can replace current weightlifting with free-for-all weightlifting. If bodybuilding works fine with a drug federation and a doping control federation, which, like in weightlifting, works a certain amount in that the bodybuilders who are tested aren't quite as big as the bodybuilders who aren't, then why should we remove anti-doping from weightlifting when we can follow in their footsteps? And if people desire, just create a second federation that isn't drug tested.
I don't know if bodybuilding really does work fine with a non-tested division. I think it's a little bit different. Do people really care about the drug-tested bodybuilders? Seb does make a really good argument as far as the weightlifting portion is concerned, and I wanted to bring this up, is that if you do actually want to, let's say, I believe you should continue to have an anti-doping group that is involved with the Olympics, and then you have a doping group. To me, the doping group is Klokov, is Ilya traveling around the United States, is whatever John North used to do, but mainly what Ilya and Klokov were involved with. Dude, those guys made good money doing that. Klokov's successful financially because he took a lot of gas and impressed people in seminars, and it's actually wow, he's probably made more money on the gear doing these seminars, still sharing his knowledge. Now, he was also on the gear when he was competing, but now he's figured out how to make more financially lucrative ways. If you do have that private area that you want to go into, using Klokov as an example, and I'll use Clarence as an example because he has admitted to drug usage and whatever, that's cool, dude, that's awesome. Clarence feels better training on gas. He's likely on test in DECA, or he's likely on test and maybe Anavar when he's a little bit leaner or whatever, something along those lines. He probably feels a lot better and it's a lot more enjoyable for him, and that's okay. And no one is demonizing Clarence, at least not people I know. People like watching his stuff because he puts out good content, he's got solid movement, and he's a good, enjoyable person. So I think it's like the people who are already on drugs now, like they're actually might be in a better situation because they can make more money financially from it. But it's still important that the mass of athletes are able to compete clean because they want to compete clean. They want to push themselves as far as they can while still maintaining that cleanliness and not having anabolics in their system.
I think another assertion made here that doesn't quite sit right with me is this idea that athletes from clean countries simply cannot compete under the current system. Given that there is a world champion from the USA and that there are an increasing number of international medalists from countries with strong anti-doping systems, it seems clear that the current system is enabling clean athletes to compete and even win sometimes, even if the system clearly isn't perfect and it does skew heavily against them.
This may have been a misunderstanding, or I didn't say things correctly in my first video, but I don't believe that. Of course, athletes can compete clean in the current system and be successful. I would rephrase my argument to talented athletes can't compete against athletes that are equally talented and on gear. He mentions Kate Nye and other athletes, most likely clean, being successful. Now, most people would make the argument that they may in fact be on PEDs right now, which is a fair argument. But to make it short, I actually believe most American, German, Spanish, British weightlifters, etc. are clean because of anti-doping culture and their personalities. I guess over the years I've developed steroid x-ray eyes and I can determine who's clean. Whatever, I could talk about this for ages and make more points.
Clarence and Zeb brings up the argument that, look, the system is improving, and you can even see Kate and I, Matty Rogers, both medaled at a non-Olympic weight class. Clarence comes back, says that weight class wasn't that challenging. Well, Kate and I did beat North Korean when she did this, and she will be effective if, in the Olympics, I believe. And if we can even bring up athletes like CJ Cummings, these guys have the capability of pushing some guys around who are or have in the past taken anabolics. I actually really like this argument from Zeb because it does show, and the key factor here is to remember that weightlifting in the US is still pretty young. There's a lot of younger kids who are now into it at a very early age. Weightlifting now is 6, 7, 8-year-olds learning the technique at an earlier stage, like they do in a lot of the Eastern European countries or even in the Asian countries where weightlifting is more prominent. And I think that is a key factor to recognize, and you're gonna see that success continue. It's easier to me with women in the US to be more successful on the international stage. I was part of a team that won the Junior World Championship in 2018 in Uzbekistan. Women are less likely to use performance-enhancing drugs. They still do, but not to the degree of men. There's examples of, especially in weightlifting with CJ, and at points in his career, Harrison as well. And I, you can even argue someone like Wes Kitts, who's won a Pan American Championship. He's competed against guys that are from notorious drugged countries, and he's still competed well and won an international title there. So that is important to understand that I don't believe it is as broken as Clarence is putting on.
I don't understand how WADA's criteria can stop athletes taking dangerous drugs right now. I don't know, maybe I'm just misrepresenting his argument, or he didn't explain it correctly.
So safe drugs, as Clarence pointed out, aren't something that can only be taken in a world without drug testing. If the drugs truly are safe, and then we make them readily available and easy for anyone to get hold of, then they would be legal substances.
I never said in a world without anti-doping that athletes can use safe drugs. I said athletes would at least have the option to use safer drugs compared to what is necessary now to win, at least. And I still don't understand how that's an argument against my position. It's like his argument assumes people are not breaking the rules right now. I could make an argument against his WADA criteria point, but I don't think his point is attacking my argument. It'd be great if Seb could elaborate on this argument because maybe I'm missing something. So that was near the end of Seb's video. At the end, he just gave a conclusion.
I think that ultimately Clarence sees that drug testing makes things unfair. And I agree with him that the current version of drug testing, where people look the other way and money exchanges hands, goes under the table, it is unfair. But I just also think that no drug testing would also be even more unfair.
It's not completely impossible that anti-doping could stop a lot more corruption and catch a lot more people using PEDs. Could it stop it completely? No, but its efficacy can increase dramatically.
Okay, so one other thing that I think Clarence brings up that is not accurate is he brings up, no one in he actually mentions track and field or athletics and in weightlifting is going to break a world record from drug users in the past or people who are on drugs, or they can't break the world record clean. And I think that it's important that when you make these statements, I would just look up Mondo Duplantis, who broke the world record in the pole vault, and Ryan Krauser, he's broken the world record in the indoor shot and very likely will break the outdoor shot put record, world record as well. Both of them are American, and then Duplantis is also Swedish, so he competes for Sweden. Both of these dudes are tested all the time. They're also younger guys, they're in this generation, so they're probably working harder than the guys, or as hard as the guys in the 80s, if not harder, and a little bit more intelligently, because they don't have those drugs. So it is possible for today's generation to be capable of breaking world records and pushing, because the training is better, the recovery is better. Seb is standing for anti-doping being fair, and he acknowledges there's points that need to be fixed. Clarence is saying it's not fair, and he lays out both of them very clearly. And they both acknowledge it's a long discussion, okay? It's a long discussion towards this. And I think that, what are we going to do about WADA? WADA's criteria, and how are they handling everything? And I think that that's where Clarence gets into some of his ideas moving forward. Zeb offers some ideas as well. And I think that you've got to look at it from the perspective of these athletes. A lot of these world-class athletes that aren't on drugs, they don't want to go on drugs. They want to win. A lot of athletes now understand that you can win world titles without being on sauce. A lot of athletes in track and field, maybe not so much sprinting, but in some other events, even in throwing now, there's world champions in discus that are clean. There's world champions and there's world finalists. We train a world finalist here, Sam Mattis, who is clean. He's drug tested all the time. We trained Nick Gwizdowski. He's a 2-time world bronze medalist in wrestling. He's beaten men who've tested positive. So it is possible. And they don't want to go on drugs. They like to stay clean because they enjoy their health and they feel better about their accomplishments. That's just part of that spirit of sport, is they feel better about what they're going to accomplish. To address this, what can we do? I think there's a couple key factors. I believe it's a system problem. I don't believe it's that we should just get rid of anti-doping. I think you've got to look at it from, there's a lot of problems specifically in Olympic weightlifting that have been embedded for decades upon decades. And we have to appoint and find people who are willing to change this from the bottom up and really educate people on the topic and what they need to look out for. And so, one, I believe that the IOC should move WADA. I don't believe WADA should be, I believe it's located in Hungary. I don't believe it should be there. It should be in Switzerland or Canada, some country that has their stuff together a lot more than Hungary. And I think if you move it to Switzerland, where the IOC is, I think it's gonna be a lot more effective, and they're probably gonna get even more funding. The next step would be, if you are a country like North Korea or Iran or Turkmenistan, you can't compete. You cannot compete. And that's got to be a ruling. That's got to be putting the hammer down. North Korea, Iran, Turkmenistan, you guys are out unless you let us in. Then we can go in there. Now, other countries that might be involved with designer steroids, there's probably some place in the US that has designer drugs. There's probably some place in China that's creating tons of designer drugs. Now we have to go in and investigate these areas and have someone, on the streets, nose to the grindstone, looking for those locations. And then I do believe that over time, the sport will get cleaned up. I think that performance enhancing drugs, they're becoming less looked upon in a negative light. We know that, I think Anavar even is still utilized today to help patients with HIV. Okay, and I think that that's a great thing. And I think that there are a lot of drugs that do tremendous things for a lot of people's health. Testosterone's one of them. Testosterone's a life-saving hormone for millions of men. And I think that now people are pretty well educated on this, just like the issue with the topic with marijuana. So I do believe that we're making some good progress in that regard. I think that the other key factor is that a lot of athletes, one of the things Clarence said is like, well, people are alternating their urine. Well, a lot of urine testing is no longer, it's not as prominent. I have athletes get drug tested here at the gym all of the time. Every 2 weeks we have drug testers coming in because of how many athletes we have in various sports. And a lot of them get blood work done. A lot of them are getting blood work done. And I think as WADA would get more funding or WADA would get more belief, right, now we would be able to provide more blood work, more blood testing, and that becomes easier to manage and to handle. And so I think that it's important that changing the system and offering those alternatives is much more important than saying anti-doping isn't working, throw it out the window. Anti-doping is working, and it's working effectively, and it's just a long process, just like this discussion. This discussion is progressive, it's positive, because now we're seeing where there's different holes and where we can improve upon and how we can continue to further and improve the sport of Olympic weightlifting so it stays in the Olympics, and we can improve all sports that drug usage is involved in. If you want videos about the best steroids for Olympic weightlifters to take, click on this video right here. I dive deep into all of the positive drug tests and what people take and why they take it and what popular lifters have been popped. Until next time, guys, peace.